Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western Literary Canon out loud. Today we are moving on to Journal Collection number 34, obviously by Emerson, and it dates from the year 1843, and Emerson would turn 40 years old that year. This particular collection begins with a couple little inscription things here, and uh, unlike many, they are actually given footnotes in English, so I will be able to read them. So the first one starts, it's a Greek quotation. It doesn't say who it's from, but I'll read it in English. According to itself, by means of itself, always of one kind. And the next one here translates as, according to each man's faith. And then there is another, which is in English, and it's from Plato's Phaedrus, and I'll read that. And whatsoever soul has perceived anything of truth shall be safe from harm until another period. After this, there is an editor's note, a sort of biographical update, and I will read that as well. In January, Mr. Emerson set forth on a long lecturing trip. He went to Philadelphia, probably visiting there his friend and loving schoolmate, Reverend William H. Furness, thence by rail to Baltimore, where he gave 2 lectures, visiting Washington, between them after an interval of 16 years. He then gave his course on New England in New York in February before the Berean Society. 1. Genius of the Anglo-Saxon race. 2. Trade. 3. Manners and customs of New England. 4. Recent literature and spiritual influences. And 5. Results. Meantime, Henry Thoreau, chivalrous, universally helpful, witty, and kind, had manned the wall at home for his absent friend, and had also relieved him of much editorial work for the Dial. This will appear in the Familiar Letters of Henry David Thoreau, edited by Mr. F. B. Sanborn for that period. End of editor's note. Baltimore, Barnum's Hotel, January 7th, 1843. Here today from Philadelphia. The railroad, which was but a toy coach the other day, is now a dowdy, lumbering country wagon. Yet it is not prosaic, as people say, but highly poetic, this strong shuttle which shoots across the forest, swamp, river, and arms of the sea, binding city to city. The Americans take to the little contrivance as if it were the cradle in which they were born. At Philadelphia. Philosophy shakes hands at last with the simplest Methodist, and teaches one fact with him, namely, that it is the grace of God, all grace, no inch of space left for the impertinence of human will. Everything is good which a man does naturally, and nothing else. And sitting in railroad cars, happy is he who is moved to talk, and knows nothing about it. And happy he who is moved to sit still, and knows not that he sits still. But I hate him with a perfect hatred who thinks of himself. Let a man hate eddies, hate the sides of the river, but keep the middle of the stream. The hero did nothing apart and odd, but travelled on the highway, and went to the same tavern as the whole people, and was very heartily and naturally there, no dainty protected person. Quote, every bullet will hit its mark, if it is first dipped in the marksman's blood. It makes men very bad to talk good. An American is served like a noble in the city hotels, and his individuality as much respected, and he may go imperially along the highways of iron and water. I like it very well that in the heart of democracy I find such practical illustration of high theories. Mr. Siddons said to her niece, Fanny Kemple, you are an extraordinary girl, but you are not Mrs. Siddons yet, though many will tell you that you are. At Washington, January 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th. Quote, the winter arrangement to the south, advertises the great central mail route through from Baltimore to Charleston, with but 3 changes of person and baggage. January 16th. So much novel reading ought not to leave the young men of the land quite unaffected, and doubtless does idealize them. They must study noble behavior, and this dignity of hotel armchairs is not quite unsupported by inward dignity. I understand poverty much better than riches, and it is odd that one of my friends who is rich seems to me always accidentally so, and in character made to be poor. I do not observe that many men can aid others in the direct way. Commonly, every man occupies every inch of his ground. The poor or the middle class can better help than the richer. Giles Waldo told me of one of his friends who gambled not for winnings but for bread and with the members of the legislature of Indiana, and the men whose money he won liked him so well that they one day made him clerk of the House of Representatives, much to his surprise, and if he had remained in that country would have made him Secretary of State. In Philadelphia they play chess in all houses. At the Athenaeum, a game goes on behind a screen at all hours, and whenever I was in the room, I noticed several spectators watching the moves of the players. New York, February 7th. I am greatly pleased with the merchants. In rail car and hotel it is common to meet only the successful class, and so we have favorable specimens, but these discover more manly power of all kinds than scholars, behave a great deal better, converse better, and have inexpensive and sufficient manners. Dream-like traveling on the railroad, the towns through which I pass between Philadelphia and New York make no distinct impression. They are like pictures on a wall, the more that you can read all the way in a car a French novel. February 7th. Nature. Nature asked whether troop and baggage to be two things, whether the world is all troop or all baggage, or whether there be any troop that shall not one day be baggage. Easy, she thinks it, to show you the universal soul. We have all sucked that orange, but would you please to mention what is an individual? She apologized for trifling with you in your nonage, and adding a little sugar to your milk that you might draw the teat, and a little glory afterward to important lessons, but declared she would never tell you another fib, if you had quite settled that Buddhism was better than hands and feet, and would keep that conviction in the presence of two persons. As for far and too far, she wondered what it meant. She admires people who read and people who look at pictures, but if they read until they write, or look at pictures until they draw them, she curses them up and down. She has the oddest tastes in behavior. An onion, which is all coat, she dotes on, and among birds she admires the godwit. But when I hinted that a blue weed grew about my house, called self-heal, she said, "A coxcomb named it, but she teaches cobwebs to resist the tempest." And when a babe's cries drove away a lion, she almost devoured the darling with kisses. She says her office of dragoman is vacant, though she has been much pestered with applications, and if you have a talent of asking questions, she will play with you all your life. But if you can answer questions, she will propose one, which if you answer, she will die first. She hates authors, but likes Montaigne. Webster. Webster is very dear to the Yankees because he is a person of very commanding understanding, with every talent for its adequate expression. The American, foreigners say, always reasons, and he is the most American of the Americans. They have no abandonment, but dearly love logic, as all their churches have so long witnessed. His external advantages are very rare and admirable. His noble and majestic frame, his breadth and projection of brows, his coal-black hair, his great cinderous eyes, his perfect self-possession, and the rich and well-modulated thunder of his voice, to which I used to listen sometimes, abstracting myself from his sense merely for the luxury of such noble explosions of sound, distinguish him above all other men. In a million you would single him out. In England he made the same impression by his personal advantages as at home, and was called the Great Western. In speech he has a great good sense, is always pertinent to time and place, and has an eye to the simple facts of nature, to the place where he is, to the hour of the day, to the sun in heaven, to his neighborhood, to the sea, or to the mountains, but very sparingly notices these things, and clings closely to the business part of his speech with great gravity and faithfulness. "I do not inflame," he said on one occasion. "I do not exaggerate. I avoid all incendiary allusion." He trusts to his simple strength of statement, in which he excels all men, for the attention of his assembly. His statement is lucid throughout and of equal strength. He has great fairness and deserves all his success in debate, for he always carries a point from his adversary by really taking superior ground, as in the Hayne debate. There are no puerilities, no tricks, no academical play in any of his speeches. They are all majestic men of business. Every one is a first-rate Yankee. He has had a faithful apprenticeship to his position, for he was born in New Hampshire, a farmer's son, and his youth spent in those hardships and privations which add such edge to every simple pleasure and every liberalizing opportunity. The almanac does not come unnoticed, but is read and committed to heart by the farmer's boys. And when it was announced to him by his father that he would send him to college, he could not speak. The struggles, brothers and sisters in poor men's houses in New England, are dear to each other, and the bringing up of a family involves many sacrifices, each for the other. The faults that shade his character are not such as to hurt his popularity. He is very expensive and always in debt, but this rather commends him, as he is known to be generous, and his countrymen make for him the apology of Themistocles, that to keep treasure undiminished is the virtue of a chest and not of a man. Then there is in him a large share of good nature and a sort of bonhomie. It is sometimes complained of him that he is a man of pleasure, and of all his chosen friends are easy epicures and debauches. But this is after all Talleyrand's taste, who said of his foolish wife that he found nonsense very refreshing. So Webster, after he has been pumping his brains in the courts and the Senate, is no doubt heartily glad to get among cronies and gossips where he can stretch himself at ease and drink his mulled wine. They also quote as his 3 rules of living: 1. Never to pay any debt that can by any possibility be avoided. 2. Never to do anything today that can be put off till tomorrow. 3. Never to do anything himself which he can get anybody else to do for him. All is forgiven to a man of such surpassing intellect and such prodigious powers of business which have so long been exerted. There is no malice in the man, but broad good humor and much enjoyment of the hour, so that Stetson said of him, "It is true that he sometimes commits crimes, but without any guilt." A great man is always entitled to the most liberal interpretation, and the few anecdotes by which his opponents have most deeply stabbed at his reputation admit of explanation. I cannot but think, however, that his speech at Richmond was made to bear a meaning by his Southern backers, which he did not intend, and I have never forgiven him that he did not say, "Not so fast, good friends, I did not mean what you say." He has misused the opportunity of making himself the darling of the American world in all coming time by abstaining from putting himself at the head of the anti-slavery interest, by standing for New England and for man against the bullying and barbarism of the South. I should say of him that he was not at all majestic, but the purest intellect that was ever applied to business. He is intellect applied to affairs. He is the greatest of lawyers, but a very indifferent statesman for carrying his points. He carries points with the bench, but not with the caucus. No following has he, no troop of friends, but those whose intellect he fires. No sweaty mob will carry him on their shoulders, and yet all New England, to the remotest farmhouse or lumberer's camp in the woods of Maine, delights to tell and hear of anecdotes of his forensic eloquence. What he said at Salem, at the Knapp trial, and how in Boston he looked a witness out of court. Once he set his great eyes on him and searched him through and through. Then, as the cause went on, and his prisoner's perjury was not yet called for, He looked round on him as if to see if he was safe and ready for the inquisition he was preparing to inflict on him. The witness felt for his hat and edged towards the door. A third time he looked on him, and the witness could sit no longer, but seized his opportunity, fled out of court, and could nowhere be found, such was the terror of those eyes. People think that in our license of construing the Constitution and the despotism of public opinion we have no anchor, and one Frenchman thinks he has found it in our marriage and one in our Calvinism. But the fact of two poles is universal. The fact of two forces, centripetal and centrifugal, is universal, and each develops the other, each by its own activity. Wild liberty develops iron conscience. Want of liberty strengthens decorous and convenient law, which supersedes in a measure the native conscience. Queenie makes herself merry with the reformers who make unleavened bread and are foes to the death of fermentation. Queenie says, God made yeast as well as wheat, and loves fermentation just as dearly as he loves vegetation, that the fermentation develops the saccharine elements in the grain, and makes it more palatable and more digestible. But that they wish the pure wheat, and will die, but it shall not ferment. Stop, dear nature, these incessant advances, let me scotch these ever-rolling wheels. Earth spirit, living a black river like that swarthy stream which rushes through the human body, is thy nature, demoniacal, warm, fruitful, sad, nocturnal. February 8th. As we go along the street, the eyes of all the passengers either ask continually of all they meet, or else assert to all. Only rarely do we meet a face which has the balance of expression, neither asking leave to be, nor rudely egotistic, but equally receptive and affirmative. W. A. Tappan says that when a man is looked at, he instantly assumes a new expression, and strangers whom he meets every day in the street grow angry at being regarded. Strict conversation with a friend is the magazine out of which all good writing is drawn. Editor's note. Here follow the passages from Experience, on God's delight in isolating us and hiding the past and future, on the eye making the horizon, and the mind's eye deifying persons, and on skepticisms as limitations of the affirmative. See Essays, second series, pages 67, 68, 76, 77, and 75. End note. Men may affect modesty as much as they will. Every speaker wants the most intelligent audience, wants genius to hear him. It is very funny to go into a family where the father and mother are devoted to the children. You flatter yourself for an instant that you have secured your friend's ear, for his countenance brightens. Then you discover that he has just caught the eye of his babe over your shoulder and is chirruping to him. The moral must have its origin from inward fountains, but must have its objects in the variety of social life. How much we are domesticated by the moral! I feel at home, said Mrs. B., more than among my relations, for you are honest people. So in my experience with the praying traveler at the hotel, so when I go abroad, if I enter a church, the first godly sentiment makes me truly at home. The source must not be the expectations of others, but a delight in serving and a fusion of goodwill, a delight in serving and not in being seen to serve, not the feeling of duty, but the wish to make happy. A man going out of Constantinople met the plague coming in, who said he was sent thither for 20,000 souls. 40,000 persons were swept off, and when the traveler came back, he met the plague coming out of the city. Why did you kill 40,000? He asked. I only killed 20, replied the pest. Fear killed the rest. Mr. Adams chose wisely, and according to his constitution, when on leaving the presidency, he went into Congress. He is no literary old gentleman, but a bruiser, and loves the melee. When they talk about his age and venerableness and nearness to the grave, he knows better. He is like one of those old cardinals who, as quick as he is chosen pope, throws away his crutches and his crookedness and is as straight as a boy. He is an old roux who cannot live on slops but must have sulphuric acid in his tea. There is no line that does not return. I suppose the mathematicians will tell us that what are called straight lines are lines with long curves, but there is no straight line in nature. If, as you say, we are destroying number by affirming the strict infinite, why then I concede that number also is swallowable, and that one of these days we shall eat it like custard. National characteristics stand no chance beside intellectual. Physicians say every constitution makes a new case of fever. So it is with persons. Our national traits may appear so long as we are drowsy and have headache, but put me in good spirits, search me with thought, and all nations are men together. The first Englishman I met in traveling was a frank, affectionate fellow, and the first Frenchman was a mystic. Major Devizek at the Carlton House, New York, told me of Father Antoine at New Orleans, the only man left attached to the Spanish government when the Americans took possession of the city. He never dined at home, but when the noon came, went into the nearest house wherever he walked and said, "My child, I have come to dine with you." Then they made a festival. After dinner he smoked a cigar, slept half an hour, blessed the house, and departed. When he fell sick, hourly bulletins were issued of his health. When he died, all shops were shut, all courts and legislatures were adjourned. 2 shillings were found in his desk, and his testament begged all his children of all sects, for he would not separate in this instrument those whom in a heart he had never separated, to kneel down for 5 minutes and pray that his term of purgatory might be shortened. And Protestant and Catholic knelt down and prayed. He preached a crusade against the English during the siege, and General Jackson came and thanked him and told him that his prayers and urgent addresses were as good to him as 1,000 men. He had Te Deum sung in the church. Abbess of the Ursuline Convent and her bell of St. Victor, a vow of a bell of 1,000 pounds weight, if not the victory, but because the victory. The book opened itself to the prayer of the day. It was the prayer of St. Victor. General Jackson said, "This was very extraordinary, Major Devizek, and I tell you, sir, that something very remarkable has attended this campaign. Ever since the battle on the night of the 23rd until the retreat of the British, I have had the sense that these things had occurred to me before, and been obliterated. And when I observed it, I was sure of success, for I knew that God would not give me previsions of disaster, but signs of victory. He said, 'This ditch can never be passed. It cannot be done.' We are all chemists who only know our own gold. Men cast pearls about in large companies where I go, and none but I seems to know that they are pearls. Society. I feel and own your power, but I lament that your power smothers mine. This I regret, not for my sake, for I am well content to lie hid a year, but for yours, that it prevents me making that just return which your merit demands. And I should like to justify to you your good deed and will towards me. Democracy with us is charged with being malignant, and I think it seems aimless, selfish resistance, pulling down, and wild wish to have physical freedom. But for what? Only for freedom, not to any noble end. Vitek thought that society was fast arriving at the excess of democracy, universal abolition, I think he called it, which he thought the absolute extinction of the feminine principle. Then woman will say, "I cannot stand this death," and will rise in indignation and end that epoch. Mr. V's opinion was that Mohammed had tried power, and Jesus, or I think John, persuasion, that Mohammed had felt that persuasion, this John persuasion had miserably failed, was a pretty poor shift or system of shifts, this expediency or system of coaxing, an example, and so forth, precisely that against which nowadays we write essays and lectures. And he said, "I will try this oriental weapon." the sword, which never, never will go west, and he said to Aisha, I have found out how to work it. This woman element will not bear the sword. Well, I will dispose of woman. She may exist, but henceforward I will veil it. So he veiled woman. Then the sword could work and eat. A man and a woman, he thought, the true social unit, born of the community, and that the old and the young could only exist in a state of tutelage or protection, that the only holders of property were the married couple who should not take either the name of husband or wife, but a new name common to both, and have but one vote. 3 ways of killing there were. In third, I smelled faggots. Society, he said, should not put to death, but should say, this cannot be, and it would cease. I remember what I have heard or dreamed, that the most terrific of hierarchs would be a mystic. Beware of Swedenborg in power. Swedenborg in minority, Swedenborg contemplative, is excellent company, but Swedenborg executive would be the devil in crown and scepter, faggots. In the capacious leisures of the spirit, I think we may beguile the time by the play of the understanding and the use of the hands, and yet be candidates for the divine succors and the use of divine methods as truly as if we should fold our hands and rely on transcendent methods only. Cheap literature makes new markets. We have thought only of a box audience, or at the most of box and pit. But now it appears there is also slip audience, and galleries 1, 2, 3, and backstairs and street listeners besides. Greeley tells me that Graham's magazine has 70,000 subscribers, and I may write a lecture, if I will, to 70,000 readers. Like Vitek, Brisbane thought that democracy did not wish to build, but only to tear down. To tear down, as he said, God and the bank and everything else they could see. Concord, March 12th. Home again from my long journey to count my treasures old and new, and, might it be, to impart them. The world has since the beginning an incurable trick of taking care of itself, or every hilltop in America would have counsel to offer. We sit and think how richly ornamented the wide champaign and yonder woodlands to the foot of those blue mountains shall be, and meanwhile here are ready and willing thousands strong and teachable, who have had no land to till. If government in our present clumsy fashion must go on, could it not assume the charge of providing each citizen on his coming of age with a pair of acres to enable him to get his bread honestly? Perhaps one day it will be done by the states assuming to distribute the estates of the dead. In the United States, almost every state owns so much public land that it would be practicable to give what they have and devise a system by which the state should continue to possess a fund of this sort. Gypsies and militia captains, Paddies and Chinese, all manner of cunning and pragmatical men, and a few fine women, a strange world made up of such oddities, the only beings that belong to the horizon being the fine women. Cheap is the humiliation of today which gives wit, eloquence, poetry tomorrow. All work for me, I and my day. Some persons use my language but are foreign to me, and others who use a language foreign to me are very near me. Events are the clothes of the spirit. Why should we try to steal and strip them? And we know God so, as we know each other by our garments. You flee fast, but the pursuers flee after you as fast. So said to me Mrs. Rebecca Black in New York. At the 5 Points I heard a woman swearing very liberally as she talked with her companions, but when I looked at her face I saw that she was no worse than other women, that she used the dialect of her class as all others do, and are neither better nor worse for it, but under this bad costume was the same repose, the same probity as in Broadway. Nor was she misinterpreted by her mates. There is a virtue in vice as well as a virtue. And the Spirit drove him apart into a solitary place. This does the Spirit for every man. I find it easier to read Goethe than Munt, and it must always be easier to understand a sensible than a weak man in a foreign tongue, because things themselves translate for the one and not for the other. Yet very pleasant is the progress which we make in a new language, the medium through which we explore the thoughts ever growing rarer, until at last we become unconscious of its presence and its transparency. Ellery's verses should be called poetry for poets. They touch the fine pulses of thought and will be the cause of more poetry and of verses more finished and better turn than themselves. But I cannot blame the North Americans and Knickerbockers if they should not suspect his genius. When the rudder is invented for the balloon, railroads will be superseded. And when Ellery's muse finds an aim, whether some passion or some fast faith, any kind of thing on which all these wild and sometimes brilliant beads can be strung, we shall have a poet. Now he fantasies merely as dilettante in music. He breaks faith continually with the intellect. The sonnet has merits, fine lines, gleams of deep thought, well worth sounding, worth studying, if only I could confide that he had any steady meaning before him, that he kept faith with himself. But I fear that he changed his purpose with every verse, was led up and down to this or that with the exigencies of the rhyme, and only wanted to write and rhyme somewhat, careless how or what, and stopped when he came to the end of the paper. He breaks faith with the reader, wants integrity. Yet for poets it will be a better book than a whole volume of Bryant or Campbell. Miss Peabody has beautiful colors to sell, but her shop has no attraction for house builders and merchants. Mr. Alston and Mr. Cheney will probably find the way to it. A man of genius is privileged only as far as he is a genius. His dullness is as unsupportable as any other dullness. Only success will justify a departure and a license. But Ellery has freaks which are entitled to no more charity than the dullness and madness of others which he despises. He uses a license continually, which would be just in oral improvisation, but is not pardonable in written verses. He fantasies on his piano. E. H. said that he was a wood elf which one of the maids in a story fell in love with, and then grew uneasy, desiring that he might be baptized. Margaret said he reminded one of a great genius with a little wretched boy trotting beside him. Quote, "For in thee hides a matchless light that splendors all the dreaming night. Thy bark shall be a precious stone in whose red veins deep magic hides. Thy ecstasies be known to none except those vast ethereal tides that circulate our being round but whisper not the slightest sound. Away, away, thou starlit breath, on bended knees I pray thee go. O bind thy temples not with death, nor let thy shadow fall on snow." Jock could not eat rice because it came west, nor molasses because it came north, nor put on leathern shoes because of the methods by which leather was procured, nor indeed wear a woolen coat. But Dick gave him a gold eagle that he might buy wheat and rye, maple sugar, and an oaken chest, and said, "This gold piece, unhappy Jock, is molasses and rice and horsehide and sheepskin." Editor's note. Here follow sentences from the Chinese classical work, commonly called the Four Books, translated by Reverend David Collier. These and other Oriental religious sayings were printed in the Dial. They are called ethnical scriptures. End note. Criticism. So the Gothic cathedral and the Shakespeare perfection is as wild and unaccountable as a geranium or a rabbit or an ornithorhynchus. It is done, and we must go to work and do something else. That undone something which is now hinting and working and impatient here and around us. Drawing, M.R. said from Mr. Cheney, was only a good eye for distances, and the descriptive talent in the poet seems to depend on a certain lake-like passiveness to receive the picture of the whole landscape in its native proportions, uninjured, and then with sweet heedfulness the caution of love to transfer it to the tablet of language. Health. Health is the most objective of subjects. The Vishnu Sarna said, "It is the same to him who wears a shoe as if the whole earth were covered with leather." So I spread my health over the whole world and make it strong, happy, and serviceable. To the sick man, the world is a medicine chest. Poet. It is true that when a man writes poetry, he appears to assume the high feminine part of his nature. We clothe the poet, therefore, in robes and garlands which are proper to a woman. The muse is feminine, but action is male, and a king is draped almost in feminine attire. The philosophers at Fruitlands have such an image of virtue before their eyes that the poetry of man and nature they never see. The poetry that is in man's life, the poorest pastoral clownish life, the light that shines on a man's hat and a child's spoon, the sparkle on every wave and on every mote of dust, they see not. Lectures. Ariosto said that neither a bath nor a lecture did signify anything unless they scoured and made men clean. Pride is a great convenience, so much handsomer and cheaper than vanity, but proud people are intolerably selfish, and the vain are gentle in giving. March 23rd. Two brave chanticleers go up and down stripping the plumes from all the fine birds, showing that all are not in the best health. It makes much unhappiness on all sides. Much crowing it occasions on the part of the two cockerels who so shrewdly discover and dismantle all the young beaux of the aviary. But alas, the two valiant cocks who strip are no better than those who are stripped, only they have sharper beaks and talons. In plain prose, I grieved so much to hear the most intellectual youth I have met, Charles Newcomb, so disparaged, and our good and most deserving scholar, Theodore Parker, threatened as a morsel to be swallowed when he shall come tomorrow, and all this by my brave friends who are only brave, not helpful, not loving, not creative. That I said, cursed is preaching. The better it is, the worse. A preacher is a bully. I, who have preached so much, by the help of God, will never preach more. We want the fortification of an acknowledgment of the good in us. The girl is the least part of herself. God is in the girl. That is the reason why fools can be so beloved by sages, that under all the corsets and infirmities is life and the revelation of reason and of conscience. Margaret. A pure and purifying mind, self-purifying also, full of faith in men, and inspiring it. Unable to find any companion great enough to receive the rich effusions of her thought, so that her riches are still unknown and seem unknowable. It is a great joy to find that we have underrated our friend, that he or she is far more excellent than we had thought. All nature seemed poor beside one so rich, which pours a stream of amber over all objects, clean and unclean, that lie in its path, and makes that comely and presentable which was mean in itself. We are taught by her plenty how lifeless and outward we were, what poor Laplanders burrowing under the snows of prudence and pedantry. Beside her friendship, other friendships seem trade, and by the firmness with which she treads her upward path, all mortals are convinced that another road exists than that which their feet know. The wonderful generosity of her sentiments pours a contempt on books and writing at the very time when one asks how shall this fiery picture be kept in its glow and variety for other eyes. She excels other intellectual persons in this, that her sentiments are more blended with her life, so the expression of them has greater steadiness and greater clearness. I have never known any example of such steady progress from stage to stage of thought and of character. An inspirer of courage, the secret friend of all nobleness, the patient waiter for the realization of character, forgiver of injuries, gracefully waving aside folly, and elevating lowness, in her presence all were apprised of their fettered estate, and longed for liberation, of ugliness and longed for their beauty, of meanness and panted for grandeur. Her growth is visible. All the persons whom we know have reached their height, or else their growth is so nearly at the same rate with ours that it is imperceptible, but this child inspires always more faith in her. She rose before me at times into heroical and godlike regions, and I could remember no superior women, but thought of Ceres, Minerva, Proserpine, and the august ideal forms of the foreworld. She said that no man gave such invitation to her mind as to tempt her to full expression, that she felt a power to enrich her thought with such wealth and variety of embellishment as would, no doubt, be tedious to such as she conversed with. And there is no form that does not seem to wait her beck, dramatic, lyric, epic, passionate, pictorial, humorous. She has great sincerity, force, and fluency as a writer, yet her powers of speech throw her writing into the shade. What method, what exquisite judgment, as well as energy in the selection of her words, what character and wisdom they convey. You cannot predict her opinion. She sympathizes so fast with all forms of life that she talks never narrowly or hostilely, nor betrays, like all the rest, under a thin garb of new words, the old droning, cast-iron opinions or notions of many years' standing. What richness of experience, what newness of dress, and fast as Olympus to her principle, and a silver eloquence which inmost Polymnia taught. Meantime all this pathos of sentiment and riches of literature and of invention, and this march of character, threatening to arrive presently at the shores and plunge into the sea of Buddhism and mystic trances, consists with a boundless fun and drollery, with light satire, and the most entertaining conversations in America. Her experience contains, I know, golden moments, which, if they could be fitly narrated, would stand equally beside any histories of magnanimity which the world contains. And whilst Dante's Nuova Vita is almost unique in the literature of sentiment, I have called the imperfect record she gave me of two of her days Nuovissima Vita. A working king is one of the best symbols. Alfred and Ulysses are such, and we see them now and then in society, oftener off the throne, of course, than on it. This is the right country for them. A chamber of flame in which the martyr passes is more magnificent than any royal apartment, and this martyr palace may be built up on any waste place instantly. Persons are fine things, but they cost so much. For thee I must pay me. Fine constellation of people, rare force of character and wealth of truth, they ought to cluster and shine and illuminate the nation and the nations. Alcott said reasonable words about the dial, that it ought to be waited for all by the newspapers and journals. The abolitionists ought to get their leading from it, and not be able to spurn it as they do. It should lead. Here the scepter is offered us, and we refuse it from poorness of spirit. When I see what fine people we have, I think it a sort of King Rene period. There is no doing but rare and shrilling prophecy from bands of competing minstrels, and the age shall not sneak out, but affirm all the beauty and truth in its heart. Quote, Dial has not piety. The same person should not constitute a standing committee on reform. A man may say, I am the chief of sinners, but once. He is already damned if, having come once to the insight of that condition, he remains there to say it again. But the committee on reform should be made of new persons every day, of those just arrived at the power of comparing the state of society with their own daily expanding spirit, fatal to discuss reform weekly. The poorest poet or young beginner in the fine arts hesitates to speak of the design he wishes to execute, lest it die in your cold fingers. And this art of life has the same pudency and will not be exposed. It is a great joy to get away from persons and live under the dominion of the multiplication table. Milton is the most literary man in literature. We are greatly vexed when poets, who are by excellence the thinking and feeling of the world, are deficient in truth of intellect and of affection. Then is feeling unfeeling, and thought unwise. The conversation turned upon the state and duties of woman. As always, it was historically considered, and had a certain falseness so. For me today, woman is not a degraded person with duties forgotten, but a docile daughter of God with her face heavenward, endeavoring to hear the divine word and to convey it to me. I read again the verses of Margaret with the new commentary of beautiful anecdotes she had given, freshly in my mind. Of course, the poems grew golden, the twig blossomed in my hands, but a poem should not need its relation to life to explain it. It should be a new life, not still half engaged in the soil, like the new created lions in Eden. Do you know how diamonds and other gems were invented? Rim, wishing to go on the errands of Ormuzd through the kingdoms of Araman without discovery, received from Ormuzd a pod of lupin, 7 days in the form of 7 diamonds. He used each of them as a lamp, which, spent, gave him a sharp and wise light for his path for 24 degrees of the way. On other occasions, Ormuzd gave him spring days in the form of emeralds, midsummer days in the shape of rubies, and autumn in topazes. All these stones are children of day. The world must be new as we know it, for see how lately it has besought itself of so many articles of the simplest convenience, as for example wooden clothespins to pinch the clothes to the line, instead of metallic pins, were introduced since the peace of 1783. My mother remembers when her sister, Mrs. Inman, returned from England at that time and brought these articles with her furniture, then new in this country, then the India rubber shoe, the railroad, the steamboat, and the air-tight stove, the friction match, and cut nails. The difference between talent and genius is that talent says things which he has never heard of but once, and genius says things which he has never heard. Genius is power. Talent is applicability. A human body, an animal, is an applicability. The life, the soul, is genius. "Mamma," says the child, "they have begun again." There is a footnote here which is interesting. Louisa Alcott, or one of her sisters, was sent by her mother to find out whether the philosophers had desisted from their speculations and got from some needed task, and came in with this hopeless report. Elizabeth Hoare says, "I love Henry, but do not like him. Young men like Henry Thoreau owe us a new world, and they have not acquitted the debt. For the most part, such die young, and so dodge the fulfillment. One of our girls said that Henry never went through the kitchen without coloring." A footnote says, "Mr. Thoreau was always most modest and yet chivalrous in his treatment of women of high or low degree." Do not mince your speech. Power fraternizes power. Footnote, the rest of the paragraph is found in Natural History of Intellect, page 30. Montaigne. In Roxbury, in 1825, I read Cotton's translation of Montaigne. It seemed to me as if I had written the book myself in some former life, so sincerely it spoke my thought and experience. No book before or since was ever so much to me as that. How I delighted afterward in reading Cotton's dedication to Halifax, and the reply of Halifax, which seemed no words, of course, but genuine suffrages. Afterwards I went to Paris in 1833, and to the Père Lachaise, and stumbled on the tomb of Auguste Collignon, who, said the stone, formed himself to virtue on the essays of Montaigne. Afterwards, John Sterling wrote a loving criticism on Montaigne in the Westminster Review, with a journal of his own pilgrimage to Montaigne's estate and chateau. And soon after, Carlyle writes me word that this same lover of Montaigne is a lover of me. Now I have been introducing to his genius two of my friends, James and Tappan, who both warm to him as to their brother. Reference. We praise the pine because it looks like a palm, the oriole because it looks like equatorial birds, and all our view of nature is adjusted to a tropical standard. The man under the line delights as much in the alpine and arctic type and dreams of the cool water and the apple and pear and peach of the temperate climates where nature serves man. Endless weak reference. Grief and joy, charity and faith get derivative in referring. Dire necessity is good and strong. I love him, I hate him, I like, I dislike. Once there was a race that subsisted, but these seeming spectral fellows that ask even when they curse and swear, or but affect to curse and swear. I wish there was no more good nature left in the world. Tomahawks are better. I think the reason why we value mystics so much is as oaks indicate a strong soil, so a thick crop of mystics shows like redemption from our universal supplication of each other. Of books. He is a poor writer who does not teach courage of treatment. The Brook Farm community is an expression in plain prose and actuality of the theory of impulse. It contains several bold and consistent philosophers, both men and women, who carry out the theory odiously enough, inasmuch as the centripetence of theirs is balanced by no centrifugence. This wish to obey impulse is guarded by no old intellect, or that which knows metes and bounds. The young people who have been faithful to this, their testimony, have lived a great deal in a short time, but have come forth with shattered constitutions. It is an intellectual sensualism. Happily, Charles Newcomb and George Bradford have been there, and their presence could not be felt as sanitary and retentive. Charles Newcomb, I hear, was greatly respected, and his conduct, even in trifles, observed and imitated. The quiet, retreating, demoniacal youth. Nathaniel Hawthorne said that Burton felt the presence of Newcomb all the time. I read in Ward's Chinese book the other day of bards, many sentences purporting that bards love wine. Tea and coffee are my wine, and I have finer and lighter wines than these. But some nectar an intellectual man will naturally use, for he will soon learn that secret that beside the energy of his intellect is capable of new energy by abandonment to the nature of things. All persons avail themselves of such means as they can to add this extraordinary power to their normal powers. One finds it in music, one in war, one in great pictures or sculpture, one in traveling, one in conversation, in politics, in mobs, in fires, in theaters, in love, in science, in animal intoxication. I take many stimulants and often make an art of my inebriation. I read Proclus for my opium. It excites my imagination to let sail before me the pleasing and grand figures of gods and daemons and demoniacal men. I hear of rumors rife among the most ancient gods, of Isonic gods, who are itinerants, of daemons with fulgid eyes, of the unenvying and exuberant will of the gods, the aquatic gods, the plain of truth, the meadow, the nutriment of the gods, the paternal port, and all the rest of the Platonic rhetoric quoted as household words. By all these, and so many rare and brave words, I am filled with hilarity, and spring my heart dances, my sight is quickened, I behold shining relations between all beings, and am impelled to write and almost to sing. I think one would grow handsome who read Proclus much and well. But of this inebriation I spoke of, it is an old knowledge that intellect by its relation to what is prior to intellect is a god. This is inspiration. They, the Neoplatonists, speak of the gods with such pictorial distinctness often that one would think they had actually been present, Swedenborg-like, at the Olympic feasts, such as, "This is that which emits the intelligible light, that when it appeared astonished the intellectual gods and made them admire their father," as Orpheus says. How often I have said what this morning I must say once more, that the conscience of the coming age will put its surveillance on the intellect. We accuse ourselves that we have been useless, but not that we have been thoughtless. Thou oughtest to have listened, will it say, so shouldest thou have heard the oracles which would elevate every day of life. It is not in the power of God to make a communication of his will to a Calvinist. For to every inward revelation he holds up his silly book and quotes chapter and verse against the bookmaker and man-maker, against that which quotes not, but is and cometh. There is a light older than intellect, by which the intellect lives and works, always new, and which degrades every past and particular shining of itself. This light Calvinism denies, in its idolatry of a certain past shining. Swedenborg, Bayman, Spinoza will appear original to uninstructed and thoughtless persons. A thinker or a man through whom shineth that light which is older than intellect, and through which alone intellect is a god, will undervalue each reporter when he beholds the splendor of the truth itself. And though such a person will do justice to the good intentions of one of these men of God who strove to say truly what they had seen, yet he will see that such as quote their words instead of listening to the truth itself, they falsify the truth. For his book is not truth, but truth Swedenborgized, or Baymanized, or Spinozized. Much poor talk concerning woman, which at least had the effect of revealing the true sex of several of the party who usually go disguised in the form of the other sex. Thus Mrs. B. is a man. The finest people marry the two sexes in their own person. Hermaphrodite is then the symbol of the finished soul. It was agreed that in every act should appear the married pair. The two elements should mix in every act. To me it sounded hoarsely, the attempt to prescribe didactically to woman her duties. Men can never tell woman what her duties are. He will certainly end in describing a man in female attire as Harriet Martineau, a masculine woman, solved her problem of woman. No, woman can only tell the heights of feminine nature, and the only way in which man can help her is by observing woman reverently, and whenever she speaks from herself, and catches him in inspired moments up to a heaven of honor and religion, to hold her to that point of reverential recognition of the divinity that speaks through her. I can never think of woman without gratitude for the bright revelations of her best nature which have been made to me unworthy. The angel who walked with me in younger days shamed my ambition and prudence by her generous love in our first interview. I described my prospects. She said, "I do not wish to hear of your prospects." This is the end of part 1 of Emerson's journal collection number 34, dating from the year 1843, when the author was 40. In the next video, we will pick up with the entry for April 10th of that year. Thank you for listening.